All right, ready to dive deep into something a little different.
Oh, I'm always up for a deep dive. Lay it on me.
Okay, so today we're looking at military food inspection.
Hmm. Interesting. Not something you hear about every day.
Exactly. But it's got this surprisingly fascinating history, and it's been super important for, well, keeping armies ready to fight.
Makes sense. An army marches on its stomach, as they say, right?
Exactly. And our main source for all this is a U.S. Army War College study. It's called Military Food Inspection, Its History and Its Effect on Readiness. Catchy title.
Straight to the point. So what kind of stuff are we going to uncover today?
Well, get this. Before the 20th century, you were actually more likely to die from disease as a soldier than from, actually fighting.
Wow, seriously. That's wild. I guess medicine wasn't quite what it is today.
Not even close. And a lot of those diseases, they came from contaminated food and water. Not a pretty picture.
Ugh, yeah, I can imagine. Food poisoning is no joke, even now. So where do we start with all this?
Well, we're going way back, even before the U.S. was officially a thing. George Washington, the first president.
Of course, the big cheese himself.
Well, even back during the Revolutionary War, he was super strict about food handling. Like, he had doctors supervising how they prepped meat and stuff.
Wow, so even back then, they knew that a healthy army needed good food.
Yeah. But was that, common knowledge back then? Or was Washington just way ahead of the game?
That's a good question. I mean, hygiene practices were definitely different back then, but it seems like Washington really got the connection between food safety and, actually being able to win battles.
So maybe not common knowledge, but definitely a leader with some foresight.
For sure. But sadly, it seems like things didn't really change that much for a while. Like, systematic food inspection didn't really become a thing until much later.
Yeah. Which brings us to a pretty major turning point, and a pretty nasty one, too. The embalmed beef scandal.
Embalmed beef. Okay, now you got my attention. Sounds rough.
It was. This was during the Spanish-American War, back in 1898. The U.S. was fighting Spain, mostly in Cuba, and the reports started coming in. Troops were getting really sick from the meat they were being fed.
Oh, man, that's awful. And embalmed beef? That doesn't sound good at all.
Yeah, the media had a field day with that name. Public was outraged, understandably. There were a bunch of investigations launched, and they figured out that, okay, maybe the meat wasn't chemically treated like people thought.
So not actually embalmed, but
Right.
still a major problem, it sounds
Well,
like.
yeah, huge problem. Turns out the hygiene in the whole food supply chain was just atrocious. Like, get this, they were using the same wagons to haul garbage and food.
Wait, seriously? The same wagons? That's just asking for trouble.
I know, right? Hard to believe anyone could eat anything under those conditions.
It really makes you wonder how they even functioned as an army with sanitation that bad.
It's pretty wild.
Yeah.
But hey, at least some good came out of it.
Silver lining.
Exactly. The scandal forced everyone to pay attention to food safety. And eventually that led to the creation of the Army Veterinary Corps in 1916 and stricter food safety laws overall.
So a public health disaster kind of paved the way for some much-needed progress.
It did. But it wasn't until World War I that things really got serious. Millions of troops to feed. Suddenly, food safety wasn't just an abstract idea anymore.
Yeah, stakes were a lot higher.
Big time. And that's where this guy, Dr. George A. Little, comes in. The study calls him the father of Army food inspection. He basically created this whole comprehensive inspection system, covering everything from, the farms where the food came from all the way to the mess halls where the soldiers were eating.
Sounds like a pretty big undertaking. Did it work?
Oh, it totally worked.
Yeah.
His 9 classes of inspection, they're still used by the military today.
Wow, that's a testament to how well designed they were. They really stood the test of time.
Absolutely. But the really mind-blowing thing is just how much food they were inspecting during World War I. Over 1.26 billion pounds of meat and dairy in just 2 years.
Whoa, hold on. 1.26 billion. That's an insane amount of food.
I know, right? Enough to feed an army twice the size of the one they had.
That's incredible. They must have had a massive operation going on.
They did. And they didn't just inspect it, they actually stopped nearly 11 million pounds of potentially dangerous food from getting to the troops.
Whoa, can you imagine if all that bad food had gotten through? It could have been disastrous.
Exactly. It would have crippled the whole fighting force. Suddenly, checking boxes and inspecting food doesn't seem so mundane anymore, right?
Definitely not. You're talking about saving lives and making sure the army can actually do its job.
Exactly. And the story keeps going, Between the world wars, they started focusing on things like protecting families from unsafe milk and dairy.
So it wasn't just about the soldiers anymore, but about the whole population.
And then, of course, World War II happened, troops all over the globe, totally different logistical challenges.
Yeah, I bet that really put their system to the test.
Oh, absolutely. Get this. During World War II, the Veterinary Corps inspected a staggering 142 billion pounds of food. 142 billion.
142 billion. That's almost unimaginable.
Yeah.
Like, how do you even wrap your head around a number that big?
I know, right? And it wasn't just meat and dairy anymore. They started inspecting non-animal foods too.
Why was that? Didn't they have people specifically for that?
They did, but there weren't enough other sanitary controls in place. So they basically had to step up and fill the gap. Talk about adaptability, right?
That's pretty amazing. They really had to think on their feet and do whatever it took to keep the food supply safe.
And it wasn't just during wartime either. After World War II, military vets actually helped rebuild safe food supplies in the countries they occupied.
Oh, wow. I never thought about that. So their work had a global impact, not just a military one.
Yeah, pretty cool, right? But the story doesn't end there. In the 1950s, things shifted again. The Army started handing over some of its inspection duties to the USDA.
So they were sharing the responsibility a bit. I guess that makes sense. Avoid doing the same work twice.
Right, it was all about efficiency. Streamlining things, but still making sure the troops were getting safe food?
Finding that balance must have been tricky.
Definitely. And then came Vietnam, which was a whole other can of worms, so to speak.
Oh, yeah, I bet. Jungle warfare, totally different environment. Must have been a nightmare for food safety.
It was. Few reliable sources of safe food, logistics were a constant headache. The whole situation was changing all the time.
So how did they even manage to keep the troops fed safely in that kind of environment?
It took some serious ingenuity, let me tell you. The study mentions that they even dyed approved ice blue so troops could easily tell it was safe.
Dyed ice blue. Wow, that's a clever solution. Simple, but effective.
Exactly. They had to think outside the box to keep those guys healthy.
Sounds like they were up to the challenge. But I imagine things didn't get any easier after Vietnam, did they?
Not really. The 1970s brought a whole wave of scrutiny on government spending, calls for more efficiency everywhere. And the Army Veterinary Corps, well, they were under pressure to prove their worth. Like, really prove it.
So basically, they had to justify their entire existence during a time when everyone was looking to cut costs and streamline things. That's a tough spot to be in.
It was. And that's just where we'll pick things up next time. So they were facing some tough questions about their role and whether they were really worth the costs.
Yeah, exactly. They had to convince everyone that their work was crucial, not just some extra layer of bureaucracy.
Did they manage to pull it off?
They did, eventually. They showed everyone just how important their work was for keeping the military running smoothly. But, it wasn't always easy. There were some bumps along the way.
Oh, I bet. What kind of bumps are we talking about?
Well, there was this whole meat scandal in Boston back in 1975. They called it the Boston Massacre.
Boston Massacre. Okay, now I'm really curious. What happened?
It all started with this one meat packer in Miami. He felt like Army inspectors were treating him unfairly compared to a company up in Boston.
So he was feeling like there was a double standard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he wasn't afraid to speak up about it. This guy filed a complaint, and that triggered a whole bunch of investigations.
And what did those investigations find? Was he right?
Well, it turned out to be a lot bigger than just one disgruntled meat packer. They uncovered this whole web of fraud and corruption, people cutting corners, bribery, the whole 9 yards.
Wow, so it was way more serious than anyone initially thought.
Oh, yeah, it was a huge mess. It wasn't just about one bad apple. It was about systemic problems in the whole system the military used for buying and inspecting meat.
So this one complaint basically blew the lid off the whole thing.
Pretty much. It led to criminal investigations, people getting indicted, and in the end, a complete overhaul of how the military handled meat procurement.
So a pretty big wake-up call for everyone involved.
Absolutely. It showed everyone how important transparency and accountability are when you're dealing with something as essential as food safety.
It's easy to forget how much we rely on those systems working properly. We just assume things are being handled correctly, and then something like this happens, and it's like, whoa, okay, maybe we need to pay closer attention.
Right. It's a good reminder that even the parts of the system that seem boring or routine can have huge consequences if they're not done right.
Definitely. So this Boston Massacre, that was a pretty big turning point. But were there other major changes happening in the 70s as well?
There was another big one in 1980. That's when the Army became the sole food inspection agency for all branches of the military.
Ah, so they centralized everything, made it all fall under one roof.
Exactly. Streamline the whole process and really emphasize the expertise of the Army Veterinary Corps. They were the go-to guys for food safety across the board.
Makes sense. You want the people who know what they're doing in charge of something this important.
Right. And they actually created a new role at that time, too, the veterinary warrant officer, specifically trained as a food inspection technician.
So they were really investing in specialized knowledge to make sure they were doing things right. But throughout this whole deep dive, it's really struck me that military food inspection, it's not just about regulations and logistics. It's really directly tied to how effective the military can actually be.
Yeah, it's easy to overlook that connection, but it's so important. I mean, think about it. If your troops are constantly getting sick from bad food, they're not going to be much good in a fight.
It seems pretty obvious when you put it like that.
It is, but it's often overlooked. The study really drives home the point that food safety is absolutely essential to a military's success. If soldiers are getting sidelined by food poisoning, morale plummets, missions get compromised, it can literally mean the difference between winning and losing.
Those are pretty high stakes.
They are.
Yeah.
And the study actually gives some specific examples of how foodborne illness has impacted military operations. Like, during the Vietnam War, you want to guess what the third leading cause of hospitalization was?
I'm gonna guess food poisoning or
Right.
something related to that.
You got it. Diarrheal diseases. Can you imagine fighting in that heat and humidity, dealing with enemy soldiers, and then getting knocked out of commission by something you ate?
It really puts things in perspective. You don't usually think of food poisoning as a major threat in a war zone, but it clearly was a big problem.
It was, and unfortunately, it wasn't just a Vietnam-era issue either. Even in more recent conflicts, foodborne illness has had a real impact on how well troops can do their jobs. The study even mentions the 1982 Lebanon deployment, where diarrhea sidelined troops and made it harder to carry out missions.
So this is not just a historical footnote. It's something that still affects military operations today.
Absolutely, and that's why the work of the Veterinary Corps is so crucial. They're out there preventing outbreaks, making sure as few people as possible get sick, and keeping the troops healthy and ready to fight. It's a behind-the-scenes contribution, but it's absolutely essential to mission success.
I'm starting to see that food inspection is a lot more important than I ever realized.
It really is, and it's not just about the military either.
Okay, so let's take a step back for a second. We've covered a lot of ground here: early awareness, the embalmed beef scandal, the evolution of the Army Veterinary Corps, the challenges of Vietnam, and the impact on military readiness. What stands out to you as the biggest takeaway from all of this?
Hmm, that's a good question. For me, it's the realization that something as basic as food can have such a huge impact, especially in a military context. Like, the work of making sure food is safe, it's often happening behind the scenes, but it's absolutely essential for the military to be able to do its job.
And it's not just about the military, right? This whole story, it highlights how important food safety is in all our lives. We benefit from the systems that are in place to make sure the food we eat is safe, even if we don't always think about it.
That's so true. We take it for granted, but there's a whole network of people working to keep our food supply safe.
It's easy to forget about all those unsung heroes. The people working behind the scenes to protect us, whether it's the Army Veterinary Corps or folks in similar roles. They might not always get the recognition they deserve, but their work is super important.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder how many other people are out there quietly doing their jobs to make sure things run smoothly and safely for the rest of us.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into the world of military food inspection. Hopefully, this episode has given you a new appreciation for how complex and important food safety is, not just for the military, but for all of us. So we've seen how vital food safety is for, a military being successful, right? And how those lessons they learned kind of shaped how we approach food safety for everyone else too. But have you ever thought about how food safety, personally impacts your own life?
That's a good question. I don't think about it too often, if I'm being honest. I just kind of assume the food I buy is safe to eat.
That's what we all do, right? We don't really stop and think about it.
Yeah.
But there's this whole system working behind the scenes, making sure that's actually true.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy when you think about it.
It is. And it's not just like the regulations and the inspections,
Yeah.
right? It's the farmers growing the food, the people processing it, the trucks getting it to the stores. Everyone in that chain, they all got to play by the rules.
Right. It takes a village, or in this case, a whole industry, to keep things safe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And think about all the advancements we've made over the years: refrigeration, pasteurization, the different ways we can preserve food now, even tamper-proof packaging.
Oh, yeah, that's true. All that stuff has made a huge difference.
It has. It's really a testament to, like, human ingenuity, you
Yeah.
know? We need to eat, so we got to figure out how to do it safely.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But it's not like we've figured it all out, right?
Eh.
There are still new challenges popping up all the time.
Oh, for sure. Foodborne illnesses, globalization of the food supply, even the threat of bioterrorism. It's a constantly evolving field.
And that's what I think is really interesting. Food safety isn't just this, like, solved problem. It's something we have to constantly work at and adapt to.
Absolutely. And it's not just about avoiding getting sick either. It's about making sure the food we eat is actually good for us, that it has the nutrients we need.
Right. Think about all the work that goes into developing crops that can resist diseases and pests, or creating foods with extra vitamins and minerals.
Exactly. It's a super complex system with all these different pieces. This deep dive has definitely made me think about food in a whole new way.
Me too. And, after all this, I think I'm going to start paying a little more attention to where my food comes from and what it takes to get it to my plate.
I think that's a great idea. It's easy to forget about all the people who make that happen, you know?
Yeah.
The farmers, the inspectors, everyone along the way.
They're the unsung heroes of our food system, for sure.
So next time you sit down to eat, just take a minute to think about the journey that food took to get to you and all the people who made it possible.
It's definitely food for thought.
Pun intended.
Right, maybe.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into military food inspection. Hopefully this episode has left you with a new appreciation for food safety, both in the military and in our everyday lives.
It's been a fascinating journey. I've learned a lot today.
Me too. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.